We've spent many hours and many episodes building downtown Cape Lomond. The first foundations were laid over 8 months ago, and we've not just been placing buildings down, we've fitted out a multimodal transport hub, created several distinct neighbourhoods, and last week we even added our own NFL stadium. This week, we're going to complete the final piece of the jigsaw by developing the last remaining plot of land. I'll be following and talking you through 5 best practice principles that you can use in your city to help you deal with those awkward spots. And once that land's developed, we're going to set up and reveal the next phase of city expansion. So let's take a closer look at the plot that we're going to be building on today. So obviously it's an awkward shape, it's nestled right in the heart of the city centre here, and we're up against some drop in elevation and obviously some immovable objects there with the rail running right beside it. So our downtown has been built on a grid system, and we're going to continue that. I'm just going to sort of line it up with the grid that we have to the south here. I'm going to use just exactly the same sizing, and if I can remember correctly, and I hope I did, it's 112 by 96 meters. And just like the grid to the south there, we're going to be running north to south. Obviously, a little bit north of the city, as you can see, it heads off at a bit of an angle, so it's the same size grid, but it's kind of running at a 45-degree or so angle once it reaches over the threshold of one of the main buildings running through the city centre. The first principle that I'm going to use to guide me here in this particular district is a prioritisation for mixed-use buildings. Mixed-use buildings, by their very nature, really maximise limited land by combining residential, commercial, or sometimes industrial or civic spaces with a single structure or a block. And to kick things off, I'm going to be creating our own block here. I'm going to use some of the modern architecture DLC stuff here. Really nice, gives us a little splash of colour, of course, with the green on the roof as well. Where we have the awkward angle here, I'm going to use some of the pillars here, and we're going to create a little bit of a terrace, I guess, as well, which is a nice feature, and it kind of removes a bit of the jankiness away from the block itself. Now you can go wild here with the decoration. I'm just going to chuck a couple of bushes up here and give that sort of overall look that kind of looks apart from a bit of a distance. And again, it gives you perhaps maybe something you can come back in detail a little bit later on. Stick up some benches, maybe some fencing, and pergolas and all that kind of nice stuff as well. Now the nice thing about having these mixed use buildings is that it should encourage walkability and it should reduce traffic. Now in fairness, we have very little traffic in this city. There is a real lack of activity and a real lack of buzz, I think, in the city centre. So I think what I might do is potentially have a look and see what we can do from a mod point of view to try and increase the traffic. Now I'd love to say that it's just down to having superior road networks and that real big organised, transport hub and all the rest of it, but I'm not too sure about that. So yeah, I think we're going to try and introduce a little bit of hustle and bustle down here in perhaps a later episode. So these mixed-use neighbourhoods, you would expect them to be lively and sort of active with constant foot traffic. So to encourage that, I'm going to create a big plaza, a big park. I'm going to extend it out with some nice surfaces. And again, I'm going to use some of Generic Lemon's new concrete surfaces. They are lovely. Have a little bit of an opportunity this week to kind of have a play about with them and see what else is in the pack. And I definitely do recommend them if you enjoy a bit of surface work in your city. So obviously we're plopping these buildings down just now and we don't have demand for it. So they are going to be empty for the time being until demand catches up. So hopefully this plaza will encourage and actually bring in people to this part of the city for the time being. That's the plan anyway. We shall keep an eye on it and we'll see how we get on with that. So obviously with the mixed use buildings, we still have commercial properties there and hopefully they'll fill up and bring people into the area. The plaza there should again act as a bit of a magnet for people. They should come in from other parts of the city. And I also want to add some public services down here as well. So that big police station asset is a bit of a belter. It's nice and interesting from an architectural point of view, and it'll give us some opportunities to sort of extend that out. We're going to be adding some hospital assets down here as well. Now, of course, big developments like this needs plenty of parking, and this one will be no different. Again, it's going to give us the opportunity for some basic detailing, and we'll just fill some gaps and we'll get some surfaces down here a little bit later on in the build. Now, of course, we do have our grid structure, and I have no qualms whatsoever in terms of breaking that grid. If we've got a big building here, signature or otherwise, then we're going to chop away at that and we're going to make things fit. But as you'll probably notice now, what we're doing here is as we move towards the edge of the city centre, towards the rail, we're actually bringing the heights of the buildings down. And that's going to take us on to our second principle, or our second guideline really, for the build today, and that is stepping down building heights. So we've talked about that in some previous episodes where we have that transition from the big buildings, you know, the tall buildings, bringing it down gently towards a sort of midtown or mid-density area. And this particular build will be no different. We've got this plot of land right up against our commercial hub and really close to our central business district. So usually what I do for these kind of areas is to try and just take a step back. Look at the skyline from all of the angles. So, you know, spit about the city. What's it like from the north, the south, the east and the west? Are we able to really just kind of slope the buildings down from high to mid to low? But one thing you can do to help with that is that once you're happy with the heights is that you can group building types together. So use Anarchy, use Move It if you're using mods, and you can kind of mix and match and try and see what assets look like the best mix. Now of course, with different content packs you have very similar buildings. These buildings can be different in height by perhaps only maybe 1 or 2 stories. So to make sure that things don't look too uniform, you can mix and match these within the same pack. When you've got your block built, you can then grab something else, perhaps something from the China pack here. We're mixing this with the modern architecture, and again, if you're using mods, you can recolor things and you can kind of get a cohesive block out of these. So the example that we've shown here on screen is combining some, you know, high density, but perhaps lower high density buildings with some really high rise ones, and I think the development works quite well. As I said just earlier on, we're going to be using some from the same pack but different heights. And again, as I said earlier on, it's always worth taking a minute just to take a step back, have a little review, perhaps spin about, and then see if you can plug any gaps. So then we've got a nice little opportunity just to chuck in some death care, and the death wave is absolutely rife in this city. I can't fix it. Doesn't matter how much death care add in the city, the people just keep dying. So we kind of slot these in as and where we can, but it's not going to make any difference. I do have notifications hidden here because they're just not that nice to look at when you're trying to make a video, but I can assure you we have a major death wave, and we have done for many months. So if anyone has any ideas how to fix that, I am all ears. I've tried even just plopping down 1,000,000 cemeteries and 1,000,000 crematoriums, and the hearses just don't leave, you know. So it's one of these things I just need to suck up until there's a solution, I guess. Now, I really love these particular buildings. I think they're great. They look like old converted warehouses, don't they? And they're now mixed-use buildings. But these buildings, they look like they add a bit of potential history to the build. Now, I'm not necessarily trying to build a historic district, but I would like to keep 1 or 2 buildings that maybe give a nod to the past. And these buildings can preserve the history and the story of the city, but they will support, obviously, new uses. And I think that's an important thing to do when you're building your own city, is to try and get a little blend of the old and the new when it makes sense. Now that's easier said than done a lot of the times, but however, we do have a number of new assets, of course. The new US assets are brilliant for this. They didn't quite fit necessarily in this particular part of my city, but there's a ton of examples in there that you can find, and you can really get some interesting results. So do try and think of adaptive reuse of existing assets and buildings. Now, taking a hark back to what we were talking about earlier on, stepping down the building heights, it makes sense to actually bring the heights up a little bit. And again, visually, it's going to break up that sort of mid-density and heights that we have here already. And again, stringing them all together, we've got a nice effect. That looks like one big apartment development. Looks pretty sweet, and it's going to open up a little bit of opportunity and some awkward gaps for us behind us to try and create something interesting for our Sims. Which takes us in nicely to our 4th principle, or our 4th guideline today, and that's having a priority for pedestrian-friendly design. Now, to be clear, I am not making this a huge pedestrian area. We have a fairly large swathe of land over at our transport hub that is pedestrian only, and that's a fair amount of the entire downtown build. So I don't want to copy that. I don't want to extend it. And I think it would be maybe a bit impractical to have such a large swathe just pedestrian only. And I don't want everything looking samey. Remember, the idea with creating this downtown area is to try and have, you know, distinct districts and give them their own character and their own feel. And that's really what I'm setting out to do. But that said, I definitely want to get some pedestrian action going. Now, obviously, we have the big plaza. We've got a couple of pedestrian streets around there, and we've slotted in a couple of little alleys or a couple of pedestrian paths in between different buildings as well, and that should give our pedestrians a little bit of shortcut and get them away from the traffic and the fumes. But we've got to be practical, and we have to face the realities of the design of the city, and we're up against the big six lane road here, so there's only so much that we're going to be able to do. But that said, we do have a bit of integration here with the transit, and we have our subway in place already, so we're going to be building out on that, and we're trying to make our own little sort of custom plaza. Fills a gap, gets rid of an awkward space, and we should be able to get a little bit of action on the go here as well, and we get some pretty decent pedestrian action here a little bit later on, which you'll see. Now, I'm not going to go crazy with the detailing, we're just going to add really just the basics, enough to really kind of set the scene here, but the stuff that I want to add tends to be some narrow pathways or narrow streets. We want to add some trees and some vegetation, which we'll get onto just shortly. The crosswalks, of course, are always going to be important for pedestrianised areas, or even if it's not pedestrianised, but at least pedestrian-centric areas, I guess is probably the best way to describe it. So to make things up a little bit from an architectural point of view, I've used one of the train station assets there just to provide something of a bit of a contrast to the blocky buildings that we've been using so far. Now, we've used that building in the past on the F1 build, and it's pretty cool, and I like it. I think we're going to add it in, and we're going to just slot the paths right the way through it. So it looks like it's functional, it looks like people are visiting it, kind of looks like a museum or something, doesn't it? I think it's a pretty cool fit, and yeah, we're going to add them as and when we deem appropriate. That said, the vast majority of this build is all functional. So let's just get the last few bits and pieces in place here, and then we can have a look and see exactly how it pans out. So as I add some citizen props here, again, just to kind of give that impression of life, you can see we're getting huge amounts of pedestrian traffic coming out of that station. That's working really well, and that previously wasn't really happening. I can see that they are using the other paths as well, sort of shortcuts, which is lovely to see. I'm very, very happy about that. All we need to do is just add some lighting here, and just to finish things off, and it should look pretty nice at night, I think, as well. So, yep, happy with that little pedestrian area. Looks pretty cool. Now, we're not going mad in the detailing today, but one thing that does bug me in city centre builds is having vanilla grass patches. It just looks god awful. So when we have little patches of land here, I am going to try and fill them up and make them look sort of half decent. And static noise decals, again, come to the rescue. Happily, these ones just slot right under the road, which is ideal. Then we're going to use little ones, make a little bit of a walkway through here. I'm going to put an invisible pedestrian path in here a wee bit later on, and that should give us a little bit of a shortcut and a little bit of sort of abandoned shrubland. And we don't have a huge amount of this in the city centre, everything's pretty well developed, so I think having one or two patches of this probably makes sense. I think most likely somebody would turn it into a car park, wouldn't they, at some point? But yeah, we'll use that. Nice little bit of decal there to add a bit of colour, which is nice. And one thing I love about these city centre builds is the vistas that you get, you know, going through street level, and then especially if it opens up, you know, to a big civic space like this. We've got a real mix of architectural designs here, and I am enjoying the views, I must admit. Really nice, really nice. So we've got a few plots here that still need to be sort of decorated, and a few plots that are still empty that need to be built on as well. So I'm going to crack on with that and talk to you guys a little bit about some of the future plans for the city. So one of the big jobs that I have planned is to revisit the public transportation in the city. We've done all the hard work previously. We've got, you know, a couple of different transport hubs. We've got every mode of transport basically covered, and everything's sort of integrated right into the fabric of the city. But what's really missing is a master plan. These things were put in without the city being built yet, so that has its benefits. We can use up all the land that we want, and we can kind of envisage exactly where things are going to be going. We're not trying to shoehorn it in. but it does have the disadvantage in that the actual transport lines, the links themselves, they aren't joined up necessarily. So there's going to be a fair bit of work to get that done, and I think as we get into the more kind of later stages of the city, it's going to be a little bit easier because I've got a fairly good idea of exactly where things are going to go. Even if the area hasn't been built yet, I've pretty much got a fairly good idea exactly where the main population centres are going to be. So my plan of action is to do some research in terms of creating the most efficient and usable transport network that we can for this city. And of course, little districts and areas like this need to be connected, and we're not just going to be using, one mode of transport. I'd like to give our Sims plenty of options to choose from. Following on from that transit integration, what I would like to potentially do is to maybe go back to where we have these stations and these hubs and maybe try and improve some of the pedestrian access. I'd like to expand the use of the pedestrian paths, and I'm not entirely sure just exactly how possible that's going to be in terms of retrofitting, existing parts of the city. But it should encourage our Sims to actually use that mode of transport and then obviously use the pedestrian paths to get to their final destination. Now, Sims will walk enormous distances in this game. You've seen them getting out of the city on highways and railways before, So I really want to use that mechanic and use it to our advantage. I'd like a network of pedestrian paths leading directly out any of our transport modes. So whether that's, taxi ranks, bus stations, train stations, subways. And I'm hoping, well, the plan is at least anyway, that should make things a little bit more attractive to the Sims, and we'll try and push up those public transport numbers. But all of this stuff is one for another day, and I think that is going to be a fun episode. I'm quite looking forward to it, and I think we still have a bit of development still to be done before I really crack on to that, but I'll get to that in just a second. Again, just to summarise really the 5 things that we've covered today in terms of building out this little plot of land. We have looked at prioritising the use of mixed-use buildings. We've had a look at stepping down building heights and using variety to create an interesting skyline. We've talked just briefly about adaptive reuse, so that's using some older looking buildings, old warehouses for example, turned into mixed-use properties. That's what we've basically done today. Pedestrian friendly design, putting that at the heart of the build, and although I've not went too crazy with that, we've only really just touched on it, but we do have a couple of pedestrian areas in the build. And finally there, talking about transit integration, we're basically kicking the can down the road for another episode on that one. We've got at least one station in there, but the whole rejig, the whole redo will be coming into play a little bit later on in the series. So what's going to come up next in Cape Lomond? Well, this pretty sizable plot of land is going to be our urban sprawl. I want to have a significant number of low density single family homes, and I am really going to just spam the living daylights out of it. It's going to take up a huge amount of area in the city, and it's going to be really necessary. You look at any city and the vast amount of land use is down to single family homes. It's something that we have plenty of demand for, and it's something that this city is really crying out for, not just in terms of demand, but in terms of the aesthetics and how it looks from a bit of a distance, when we zoom out. So it's going to be necessary, but it's not necessarily going to make a particularly entertaining episode. So what I'm going to do on that one is going to do that on live stream. So if you are interested in that, come and give me a follow on Twitch. Link is in the description. It's always fun to have a chat with you guys when we're building along. So don't be a stranger, come and say hello. But don't expect it to be getting built quick. I can't multitask. So talking and building, that's a skill that I am still working on. Now you've seen how we completed the downtown in Cape Lomond, you might be curious to see where things began. Check out this video where we kickstart downtown development with an epic multi-level subway and pedestrian district.